speakers to discuss BC's competitive advantage. As you know, BC has closed the chapter on the HST, and the post-era HST seems like the right time to build a case for doing business in this province. Today's panel will discuss BC's competitive position from a provincial, national, and international perspective by focusing on how to make BC stronger. Jeffrey Simpson, the Globe and Mail's National Affairs columnist and winner of the prestigious Governor General's Book Award, will share his thoughts on BC's future within the context of the challenges that are facing Canada. Jock, a keen observer and commentator on the BC economy, will shift the focus of the discussion from national to provincial perspective. Mr. Finlayson will discuss his views on BC post-HST. Will the elimination of the HST weaken BC's position as a strong competitor? How can we build on its strength? And equally important, can BC shore up its weaknesses and regain any lost ground? Bruce Flexman, president of AdvantageBC, formerly known as the International Financial Centre British Columbia, IFCBC, will again shift the focus of the discussion, this time to an international perspective. Mr. Flexman will attempt to answer the question, how does the rest of the world see British Columbia? What is attracting companies from Asia and Europe to British Columbia? So gentlemen, if you could join me up on stage. And I would ask all of you again, if you have any questions, to please use the blue cards. And as we go along here, there'll be people from the Board of Trade to collect them up, and we'll try and get those questions answered. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, who will open. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the Board of Trade for asking an Ontarian to come out here in this great land of prosperity in British Columbia, where I've got my tin cup that I brought along from the equalization receiving province in Ontario. I know it's deeply ingrained in the British Columbia mentality to have pity on Ontario. All the pity we can get from you and all the money that you want to send us, because we have big deficits, high unemployment, serious problems. I don't detect that evincing much sympathy here. I thought I'd give it a try. Bruce, when he invited me, said, you've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to stick to that, because I write in a box every morning. I should be able to be disciplined. And in the 10 minutes I have, I'm just going to touch on 5 matters quickly. We can discuss them later, if you like, in the question and answer session. These are national trends, to some extent international ones, that are going to have an impact on BC and other parts of Canada in some respects. Some of them are going to challenge BC, some of them I think are an opportunity for BC. First of all, we have a majority government. If a majority government doesn't do tough things in the first year it's a majority government, the chances of doing tough things decline with each successive year. Golden rule of politics. The interesting thing about this particular government is that they actually, in the first 5 years they were in office, didn't do any difficult things. Difficult is defined by raising more revenue, or cutting government programs, or making large constituencies in the country unhappy. Instead, they cut taxes. Spending went up by 5% a year before the recession and exploded during the recession. And the $12 billion surplus they inherited disappeared, and now we have the deficits that we do. So this is not a government that has thus far demonstrated a capacity to take hard decisions. However, it has a majority. And so it is going to cut its spending, own spending, not transfers to provinces, and in the short term, not transfers to individuals, by somewhere between 5 and 10%. The vibes you hear in Ottawa are that they're actually aiming for the top of that range. And in my view, having watched many of these spending reduction experiences, if you're going to shoot high, you have no choice but to eliminate certain programs or curtail substantially certain programs. Freezing public sector wages, trimming the civil service by 5 or 10%, that doesn't get you where you need to go. Now, I don't know what programs they're going to cut, but if that's the target that they have in mind, they're definitely going to have to do it. Where these cuts will fall, I simply don't know yet. None of us do. So, in British Columbia, going to be programs. And you know, look, in the business area, there are $6 or $7 billion of programs to assist business in one form or another, either through the tax system or direct spending. Some of these are probably going to be effective. The government is also trying to suck and blow at the same time, which is a way of saying that at the same time as they're trying to reduce spending, the economy is very slow. We saw the numbers this morning. We've seen the IMF downgrade international growth projections. We've seen the Bank of Canada downgrade economic growth projections for 2012. So we're looking at something in the 2 to 2.5% range with, I would say, a 10 to 15% uncertainty factor in the international economy, meaning that we could see some very, very bad economic news starting in Europe and washing over the rest of the Western industrialized world. So at this very time when the economy is slowing down, the government is going to be withdrawing money from the economy through cutting programs, while at the same time trying to stimulate growth with its upper hand. That's what I mean by cycle. And it is a minor version of what the Europeans are trying to do, which is to impose on some of the countries severe austerity, while at the same time looking for ways of trying to stimulate growth. The second point I want to just touch on is that I think there are some very big changes coming in those programs I just mentioned for business. We have these multiple $billion of programs. The principal tool that governments have used over a long time is to stimulate innovation is the Scientific Research Development Tax Credit. That's worth about $3.3 billion a year. There are 3 reports that have come out in the last 4 years which have analyzed the panoply of programs for business, including this tax credit. And they've come to the conclusion that the government and the country is not getting a bang for its buck. So these reports are basically saying, take some of the tax credit money, turn it over to a new council called the Innovation Council. Have them invest directly in projects that the people think are going to produce innovation, and particularly producing services and products to market. We're going to change the National Research Council. So I would think that some of those existing 100 or so programs might be trimmed as part of this exercise. I think that the new innovation strategy is going to rely very much on Tom Jenkins' report and change the tax credit. IRAP, for any of you who use it, I think is going to stay pretty much as it is. Now the question is, how does this affect BC? Well, you have to wait until we see the details, but my instinct is that it might actually be helpful for the following reason. If you look at what's called BERD, B-E-R-D, which is business expenditures on R&D as a percentage of GDP, the OECD average is 1.6%. Canada is below the OECD average. We rank 18th out of 31 countries, which is one of the reasons why governments are unhappy with our performance given the panoply of these programs. Provincially in Canada, remember we're below the 1.6, Quebec is at 1.5, Ontario 1.3, BC 0.75, Alberta 0.5. Saskatchewan, by the way, is at the very bottom. I think there is a link between the oil and gas industry that's always at the bottom when it comes to research and innovation, and the fact that Alberta and Saskatchewan score so badly. I'm sorry if any of you here are in those 2 industries, but I can give you a lot of studies to justify that. So clearly, this hasn't benefited British Columbia because a disproportionate amount of the scientific and research tax credit has gone to the aerospace industry and to the pharmaceutical industry. And neither of those had a huge presence in BC vis-a-vis Ontario and Quebec. So if they adjust this mechanism, there's a better chance, I think, for other parts of the country to get some additional money. The third point I'll dwell on very fast is Aboriginal policy. You all saw the meeting last week between the chiefs and the big political chief, Harper, and his cabinet ministers. What was interesting there was what was not done. The Indian Act was not, there was no promise to abolish the Indian Act. Largely, this isn't the time or the place for a long speech on Aboriginal policy, largely because a lot of Indian nations, groups, whatever you want to call them, the country, actually don't want the Indian Act eliminated in the short term. But there was a goodwill to get along and consult each other more. But what overhung that was, and you see this all the time from the federal government, an absolute determination to get those natural resources, principally the oil from the tar sands, to Asian markets. If there's one issue on which the Prime Minister and all his ministers have spoken repeatedly, perhaps more than any other issue in the last 4 or 5 months, because of Keystone and because of the Northern Pipeline, it's that issue. How they break through the solid wall of opposition from the Aboriginal groups in northern British Columbia is going to be quite an interesting test for them. Do they resort at the end of the day to the declaratory power, the federal government's declaratory power, with severe political implications? They're going to tighten the regulatory approval process, but that will come after the National Energy Board hearings on the Northern Pipeline. But they're absolutely fixated on getting the oil and gas, particularly the oil from the tar sands. This government is tremendously wedded to the oil industry. You have an environment minister who is essentially a song and dance man for the industry. You have a natural resources and trade minister who are too. And you have a prime minister who authorized his people to say that the critics of the Northern Pipeline were all being financed by offshore money. So you can see how tightly wound they are to the oil industry. Fourth point is trade. The government, as part of its competitive policy and its philosophy, is a very strongly free trade government. And it really, belatedly, has got the fact straight that the growth in the world economy is going to come from Asia and principally from China. So the years of wagging our finger at the Chinese, of mentioning their human rights record, for Mr. Harper and Mr. Kenney and all the others who did it the first 2 years, that's over. Now we're going to do business with the Chinese. And the government is aggressively pursuing trade. And the vocation of BC, this is such a cliche, and I'll tell you, is to be focused, and more focused still on trade opportunities with Asia. And I think the government is very compatible with that agenda. I would also urge you to look south, far south. The American economy is going to be growing very slowly for the next 5 years. The recovery from financial recessions is long and painful. But if you look at South America in 2011, Argentina grew by 8.5, Chile by 6.1, Colombia 5.1, Mexico 3.9. If you look across the Pacific, Indonesia 7.1, Malaysia 4.8, Singapore 12.6, Taiwan 4.4, China 9.2. That's where the growth is in the world. That's where the opportunities are. And no place in the country is better positioned to try to exploit that than British Columbia. As you know, the Prime Minister is going to China to Harper to China next month. Government-to-government relations in a highly statist economy like China count. China's search, as you know, for natural resources spans the globe, and they're single-minded in their determination. And the fact that there are substantial Chinese communities here is a contextual advantage for British Columbia. Insofar as South Korea is concerned, a very vexatious issue of beef exports from Canada to South Korea has now been resolved. Here, however, is a case where BC has to lobby like hell because the Ontario car industry doesn't want an agreement with Korea because of Kia, right? The Korean car manufacturer, a 6-point tariff on Korean imports, and the government is under a lot of pressure, and the Minister of Finance happens to come from Oshawa. So a deal with Korea is manifestly, it seems to me, in the country's interest as a whole, very much in British Columbia's interest as a gateway to that part of the world. But there is one industry that has the ear of the government on this, and I urge all of you to do what you can. I know James Moore's coming here in a little time. Get his ear and say, get in there and fight for us. Which leads me to another area where BC really has to get its political ducks in line. The only multilateral trade forum going in the fastest growing part of the world, i.e. Asia, is something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It started with 4 small countries, Brunei, Singapore, New Zealand, then the Australians, and then the Americans got interested. Now there are 8. They've had 11 rounds of negotiations, and now the Japanese are interested in coming in, which for them is a huge step forward because they're going to have to maybe put their agricultural subsidies on the table. Our government was quite dismissive of this when it was just 4. But when the Americans and the Australians got in, they said, wait a minute, we'd like it. Except that our best friends are saying, we don't want you in. The New Zealanders, our cousins in New Zealand, are saying, we don't want you actually there. And the Australians are being politer about it. They're saying publicly, oh yes, we'd like Canada to be there. But I know for a They actually don't want us there unless, and the Americans don't much want us there because they don't want any country coming to the table with preconditions. And we keep coming to trade negotiations saying we're going to be free traders, except for supply management and agriculture, which is an extremely sensitive and important matter for the Australians, the New Zealanders, and the Americans. And if they give us a pass on supply management, then they'll have to give Japanese a pass on their rice and the other products that they protect. So we're saying we want to join. And when the Prime Minister met when Harper met Obama at the North American Summit in Chicago, he implored the President to use America's good offices to try to get us a place at the table, but we're not there yet. And it's, again, hugely in British Columbia's interest that this TPP succeed and that we be part of its success. And our possible failure to get to the table is going to be because of Central Canadian supply management. And there's a huge lobbying challenge ahead for you. The last point, this is a little plea from me. Relations with Ottawa. You can like Harper, you can dislike Stephen Harper. It is very much in the interest of BC not to go back to the politics it used to practice 15 or 20 years ago of a kind of instinctive, knee-jerk populism against Ottawa. I know that was popular. I know the hotline shows loved it. I know certain premiers used to play that game. But if you look at it coldly, BC's done way better by taking a constructive engagement approach to Ottawa under Premier Campbell, who started it, or Mr. Harcourt even before him. So whether the government changes to another political complexion next time, where the temptation will be to beat up on Ottawa because they're affiliated with the official opposition in Ottawa, I would simply urge BC leaders to reflect upon constructive engagement and what it has brought BC, which in my view is far more constructive and useful for BC than a kind of negative populism. And given this government, which doesn't take the criticism too easily, it's a particularly wise approach to take. Thank you.
Very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm pleased to be on the panel with Jeff Simpson and Bruce Flexman and you. I'm going to talk briefly about the HST, and the title of today's event is Turning the Corner on HST, and I think that's premature. I don't think we remotely come to grips with the long-term and even short-term implications of transitioning back from a harmonized sales tax based on a value-added tax model integrated with the federal GST to a made-in-BC antiquated retail sales tax that was a severe handicap to building a productive and competitive economy. So although everyone is tired of the topic of the HST, including myself, the fact is it is very important, and moving away from it is going to cause, I think, significant challenges. Just to remind ourselves what the world looked like, on June 30th, 2010, the day before the harmonized sales tax was brought into effect in British Columbia, we had the PST, the provincial sales tax or retail sales tax, in place. It raised about $5 billion a year of revenue for the government of British Columbia, and 40% of that revenue, roughly $2 billion out of $5 billion, was actually tax collected on so-called business inputs. These are the things that companies in BC had to purchase in order to produce their own goods and services. Construction materials, computers, vehicles, purchased energy, legal services, a wide range of other what we call in economics capital goods, which are fundamental to the ability of business to compete. These products actually bore 40% of the total 100% sales tax burden that the province imposed at that time. And the government of the day, rightly in my view, although wrongly in the views of 55% of the people who voted in the referendum, decided to move away from that, harmonize with the federal GST, and bring in a more modern value-added tax. That had a very beneficial effect on what we in economics call the marginal effective tax rate on capital. You want to know why most economists never marry and die alone? It's because they come up, or we come up with concepts like the marginal effective tax rate on capital. What is this? This is simply an all-in measure of the tax burden on capital formation in a market economy. So it includes not just the statutory business tax rate that we're all familiar with, it includes things like sales tax on business inputs, it includes things like capital taxes, it incorporates depreciation schedules, it incorporates investment tax credits. It's an all-in measure of the burden of tax on incremental dollar of capital investment. Notice that in BC with HST, the METR here drops very sharply as a consequence of implementation of HST. It therefore follows that as we transition away from HST back to provincial tax, our marginal effective tax rate on capital will jump significantly. And I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that will not be good for the long-term prosperity of the BC economy. There were three reasons why economists like myself generally supported HST. Actually, there were multiple reasons, but three what I call structural reasons that go to the heart of the long-term economic challenges we have in British Columbia. The first is that British Columbia has become a jurisdiction, much like the United States actually, that consumes much more than we produce. We run an absolutely gigantic trade deficit in our transactions of goods and services with the rest of the world. This includes products, services, it includes trade with other provinces and international trade. In recent years, we've been running a trade deficit, an overall trade deficit of close to $15 to $20 billion a year, which is a sign that we have kind of a structural competitive problem. And indeed, if one looks more closely at our export performance, BC, compared to the rest of Canada, has the smallest or weakest export orientation in our economy. If you add up exports of goods and services, they represent a smaller chunk of GDP, gross domestic product, in BC than in any other province of the country, which is another way of saying that we have kind of a consumption-oriented economy, not a production-oriented economy, which for long-term purposes is not where we want to be. That feeds in to the second structural problem, which HST was also designed to address: chronic lagging productivity growth. Jeffrey Simpson and others at the national level have written volumes on Canada's poor productivity performance and indeed innovation, which Jeff referenced. Weak performance on innovation is a component of that. Well, if Canada has a productivity problem, we've got a bigger one in BC because we consistently lag Canada in both the level of output per hour work and the growth rate of that indicator over time. And as I have fruitlessly tried to explain to Jim Sinclair of the BC Federation of Labour, if you want higher wages for workers in British Columbia, you have to look at productivity. Higher productivity is what lays the essential foundation for wage increases, not marching in the street with signs or going on radio programs. Jim doesn't do it. Third structural issue that we face that HST was well designed to address is a low level of capital formation per worker. In British Columbia, the amount of capital that workers have to work with in their jobs is lower than in a lot of leading comparator jurisdictions. So when you think about it in terms of the tools, the equipment, the infrastructure that our employees have to be productive, we're below average here. And HST was designed to create an investment climate that would encourage more capital formation, therefore leading to higher productivity and ultimately higher wages. And indeed, one particular category of investment in machinery and equipment, has been shown by empirical economic studies to be particularly important to growing productivity over time. BC, as shown on this chart, is at a very low level of investment in machinery and equipment, which again translates into a less productive economy, lower productivity, and lower incomes. These were all things that the HST was designed to address. The economic analysis and modeling done by academics in advance of the introduction of HST showed that over time it would lead to a higher level of business investment or retooling the capital stock. That in turn would pave the way for higher productivity and ultimately higher wages. It would also enhance our ability to grow what Michael Porter calls clusters of traded industries, industries that are capable of producing goods and services for sale outside of the local marketplace, an area where BC tends to be quite weak. And long term, it would produce enhanced competitiveness. So that's why I think it's a particular I won't say tragedy, but a particularly unfortunate course of events that through an unpredictable political process, we are now in a situation where 13 to 14 months from now, we wave goodbye to the harmonized sales tax and bring back to replace it a demonstrably inferior retail sales tax, which I think will serve the province very poorly going forward. So what can we do about speaking to the panel, the expert panel on competitiveness that our EBO is a member of, and which Kevin Falco, the Minister of Finance, just appointed a few days ago. How do we mitigate the damage that I'm convinced will be done to the province by restoring the retail sales tax and dismantling HST? Well, first of all, as Bruce will tell you in a moment, we do have quite competitive corporate tax rates in BC. We want to maintain those, and I suggest it could be quite a struggle to do so in the coming years. Second, we should be looking for ways to streamline and make the PST itself more efficient as the government reintroduces it in the spring of 2013. Third, once the government's budget position is improved, we should be looking at ways to expand the exemptions that already existed in the old PST scheme to cover certain kinds of business inputs that are known to drive productivity gains. So these would be business investments in machinery, in equipment, in telecommunication services, in other elements of the capital stock that are known to be key to boosting long-term productivity and therefore living standards. Fourth, I think we need to be looking at new types of tax incentives that we might introduce that will again be geared toward driving investment, not in cappuccino bars, but in productive capital stock that can help to advance long-term prosperity in British Columbia. Fifth, I'll look at my glasses here. We think in the Business Council, the province needs to establish a much more disciplined and rigorous process for looking at all its regulations, all its policies, and their impact on competitiveness. This does not occur today. It's a much more ad hoc process. Government is a big beast, a hydra-headed monster that spends $40 billion a year, that regulates every corner of our lives, and we think a more systematic approach to looking at screening regulation, actually along the lines of what the Conservatives at the federal level are talking about, is needed here in BC. And finally, and the least popular in the councils of municipal councils across the province, we believe we need to overhaul the business property tax structure in BC, an issue that the Board of Trade has actually played a leadership role on here in the region, which we support strongly. Most businesses in BC are paying an unfair share of local property tax. Residents are consuming most of the services. Businesses are actually carrying most of the freight. And we have tremendous variation across the province in the tax treatment of different kinds of business property. That is an area that needs to be addressed to help clean up the aftermath of what I think will be a quite unfortunate shift in tax policy in BC. From an efficient, harmonized sales tax to the old antiquated retail tax. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jock. We had a lot of fun putting this panel together. I've worked with Jeff and Jock and Elio over the years, and it's always been a lot of fun to hear what they have to say. And you'll see we probably have a bit of a divergence of opinion on some of these issues, but I think that's really healthy. I represent AdvantageBC. I have the nice task of traveling around the world, talking about BC, meeting different companies, talking to businesses. And one thing I do find is that true Canadian fashion, we sometimes don't maybe realize how good we have it. We don't realize that other places are really having great difficulties with their competitiveness as well. So I want to focus on that, really talk about a number of observations that I pick up in traveling to Asia, the US, and Europe, and really cut some of the feedback that I get in terms of how they look at BC, and then try and put that into our debate about how we improve our competitiveness in BC. I have a number of observations. Firstly, I think people here all know where BC is, but most people around the world don't really know where BC is. They know Canada. Canada has a good brand, and it's had a better brand, I think, in terms of what's happened after the financial crisis. But people tend to see BC as really just being part of Canada. So a lot of the perceptions that you see around the world are really directed at Canada, even though we sometimes think we're quite different than Ontario or Quebec or other regions. The second part of the feedback that we get is the other strong brand is Vancouver. Vancouver is known. The Olympics did make a big impact. And just because Vancouver is a destination for tourism and for resettlement, people do know of Vancouver, or they know somebody who lives in Vancouver, who's been to Vancouver. So those are probably the two big brands that we actually deal with when we travel, not BC so much. Second point I'd like to pick up, and Jeff mentioned it, is the shifting economic power within the world. This chart really shows the different growth rates, and we've probably seen this in different formats. But we are seeing a huge shift in economic power moving to Asia. And so how is that impacting what's happening on the west coast of Canada? Well, historically, our country and the continent developed because of trade flows that flowed across the Atlantic. So Europe was the first area that probably industrialized and developed. Then that transferred over to North America. And the natural gateways and entrance points were on the west coast. Now we're seeing a shift in economic power within North America. We have Jeff coming here with his cup, looking for some handouts. And resource-driven, we're seeing the western part of North America actually outperforming the eastern parts of the country. And that is largely or partially fueled by what's happening in Asia. And so the trade flows that are coming over the Pacific are much more dramatic and will increasingly become more influencers of what happens to us here in Vancouver and all along the west coast, I think, of North America. So that's an important shift that is going to impact our ability to compete because now we're in a more favorable location. Second part I want to talk about is tax. Tax is what I spent my career in, and I'm always surprised when I travel how much emphasis gets put on tax issues. In some ways you might say, an economist might look at it and say, well, I don't think tax takes up that much of the spend or the issue with respect to a business. But it certainly is something that's top of mind when people are looking to invest. Why is that? Partly because it's complicated. Partly because it's man-made. Governments decide what their tax policy is. It isn't always driven by economic factors. What you pay somebody is often supply and demand, whereas tax is sort of engineered. So that's why when Elio gets involved with this panel, they're going to be looking at how you engineer a tax system or look at the different ways in which you can affect your tax policy. So I think there is perhaps an overemphasis on tax. And that leads into my next observation. And that is, although we may think we're doing a good job on tax competitiveness, people overseas see Canada, BC, Vancouver as being high tax jurisdictions. They see it as having high tax. And no matter how many times you run your slides and try and convince them, they have this perception that we have high tax. A recent World Economic Forum publication that ranked competitiveness of different countries, they asked corporate executives what were the 5 major obstacles or challenges about doing business in a particular country. And in Canada, 2 of the 5 items related to tax. Tax rates and tax regulation. So the perception is that we have high taxes and it's complicated and we're highly regulated in that area. Let me talk about the reality. I think the reality is that we actually have improved dramatically over the last decade, such that now we do have competitive tax rates. This chart shows corporate tax rates, and you'll see BC is at 25%. That's a combination of federal rate and provincial rate. And there's countries that are lower than that, but they tend to be jurisdictions which don't offer the same level of services. But for developed economies, we're actually quite competitive. And really the major competitor that we face in terms of our tax policy sits a few miles south of the border, the United States. That's probably the biggest competitor that we have in terms of tax policy. And their tax rates start at 35%, and depending on your state, it could be 40% plus. But that only tells part of the story. As we all know, there's other taxes. We've been talking about HST and return to PST. There's a number of other taxes that business pay. And this next chart really ranks different cities based on a KPMG study on all-in taxes for a services business. And what's instructive about this is that trending, you see Vancouver and also the other Canadian cities dramatically lower than baseline US cities, and competitive with European cities, in some cases much better. So what's happening here? Probably the biggest impact, other than the corporate tax rate, are payroll taxes. Payroll taxes in this country are competitive compared to many of the other developed jurisdictions around the world. So certainly, in this case, with the services profile, you're going to have more people, more labor costs, and more potentially paid payroll taxes. So I think we are much more competitive than the perception is with respect to the worldwide audience. I do also want to talk about personal taxes, because I think sometimes the perception is driven by personal tax situations. So a lot of people think we have high taxes, and then they give you the example of how much tax they pay personally. For most businesses, personal taxes aren't generally a major consideration, because companies don't pay the tax for their employees. They pay them a wage, and as long as the wage is sufficient to cover off the taxes, then it isn't generally a factor that plays in site relocation or investments. So just in conclusion, what does this all mean for BC? We are entering into a massive shift with respect to moving from HST back to PST. I think most people would see that as a step backwards in terms of tax policy, and it will hurt the competitiveness for the province. But I think the messages are that tax policy is important. We do have some good elements of our tax policy, and it's critical that we continue to improve that competitiveness now that we are stepping back to a PST regime. And finally, having a fiscal advantage ultimately will lead to a tax advantage. So sometimes I wonder, because countries tend to delay that inevitably that will occur. We look at what's happening in the US. But if you have a fiscal problem, then you probably also have a tax issue, and you're going to have to deal with that part of it. So I think BC is moving in the right direction with respect to its fiscal situation, and that should give it the advantage with respect to tax competitiveness. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, if you have any questions on the blue cards, please hold them up and we'll come and collect them. We have people circulating the room to do that. So we've had a few questions come in, and the first one I'll field to you, Jock. We kind of talked about this. How will the impact of the return of the PST affect BC? And are there any positive things that you can think of the return to the PST? Trying to change your orientation here just a little bit.
Maybe some additional work for the accounting firms. And so there'll be some overhead costs. Economists think overhead costs are bad, but those who provide the overhead are different. There's nothing good for the province associated with shifting back to PST. There are a few industries that were hurt by HST. The restaurant industry was the most prominent one. The home building industry is second. So as we reduce the sales tax burden on those particular goods, I would think those industries will benefit. They're a very small part of what makes up the overall economy. I think we do have some tax advantages that Bruce has referenced. I think the challenge will be to preserve those in a world where population aging is underway. Governments are under a lot of political pressure to increase spending, and maybe look at the margin for some ways to tweak the provincial sales tax to make it less complicated, less burdensome, and less inefficient. That will be over the medium term. The government has pledged to bring back the PST more or less as it was on June 30th, 2010. That's a political commitment they've made, and we respect that. But I would just note in closing that the $1.6 billion, we estimate the HST saved business $1.6 billion a year in BC. So that is an additional tax burden that effective the day after the reintroduction of PST will be reintroduced onto the shoulders of BC business. That is the largest, by far, the largest tax increase on BC business in history. So it's a very, very big deal in terms of tax policy and public finance.
Thank you. Bruce?
Maybe I'll just make a few comments on the return to the PST. You know, I think to me it's a fiscal situation. It's going to be the big issue. I think there will be pressure on the government to actually start exempting more of the inputs, which is part of the HST system. So now the business has tasted that, we've seen that. Now it's all coming out that the businesses see how uncompetitive they are in certain areas. And it's not equal. When you actually get into the details of the PST, some industries actually have got a number of exemptions, so they're probably not going to be impacted as greatly as some of the industries that Jock mentioned, which will be hurt a lot harder. So now you're going to have this inequity, and I think what's going to play out is there's going to be pressure on the government to now start exempting more of these inputs into business. And so then it becomes a fiscal issue. Can the government deal with the fiscal hit that will involve in terms of making it more like the HST system that was in place, or is in place right now?
Thank you. Jeffrey, how much of an impact will the continuing challenges facing the U.S. affect business in BC? Your thoughts on
Well, hugely, not just because of the direct bilateral trade between the province and the United States and between Canada and the United States, but the weakness of the U.S. economy has a worldwide effect. So it has a drag on the entire world economy. I'm of the view that these financial crises, if you read the economic literature, have a much more devastating effect on economies than other kinds of recessions. The evidence is that it takes many more years to get the unemployment rate back to where it was before the financial collapse, that the government's fiscal positions weaken more dramatically than in other kinds of collapses and take longer to come back into where they were before the recession, that the economic growth takes longer to recover. So I think we're in for a very long, I take no pleasure in saying this, but I thought it from the beginning of the collapse, a very long period of deleveraging and slow growth. And this is particularly challenging for governments at a time when, in 2011, the first of the baby boomers began to retire. So you are looking at a context within which productivity and competitiveness has never become more important than it will in the next 10 to 15 years, because there will be fewer people as a total number of people in our society working to support a larger number of people who, by virtue of being older, will make greater demands on social programs, noticeably health. And you have a world environment in which the competition from a growing number of countries, we're all fixated on China and India, but I deliberately gave you growth rates from Indonesia, from some of the South American countries, from Mexico. So there are many countries that are wanting a better life for their citizens. But all these factors together, and I'll just end by saying that the crunch on government finances is severe, especially if you take the view that there aren't going to be any tax increases. Taxes as a share of GNP in Canada have dropped over the last 15 years from 42.5% to 39%. Taxes have dropped more here than in any other OECD country. So we have tax room if we wish to use it. But the federal government is adamantly opposed to any tax increases. And so the restoration of fiscal health has to come from economic growth, but it's going to be slow. Or spending cuts. And spending cuts have an effect on economic growth as well. So you get into a kind of vicious cycle. So I'm afraid I can't be more optimistic. I think we're still in a very difficult, and the level of government that's the most sorely affected is the provincial level. Because it's the government, it's the level that has the most labor-intensive services to be delivered to people, notably education and healthcare.
Thank you. Jock, any comments?
Well, I do. I mean, certainly the financial crash in 2008 to 2009 is not over. It's playing out. The second sort of mutation of it is playing out in the Eurozone. But even in the United States, absolutely, the outlook for U.S. economic growth is quite muted for the next several years. The job market, the labor, the proportion of Americans with jobs has gone from 63% to 58% in 4 years. Absolutely unprecedented in modern times. Plus, household debt is still too high in the U.S. Plus, the national government has not even begun to address its long-term fiscal challenges. Taxes will go up in the United States at the federal level. Spending will be cut. That will weigh on growth. So the U.S. is in the rest of this decade, in my view, the U.S. will be growing, but growing at a far slower rate than Americans have typically experienced coming out of previous post-war recessions.
Bruce, what are the reasons why foreign businesses would want to invest here in British Columbia? What are the things that attract foreign businesses and jobs to Vancouver and to British Columbia?
Depends on the type of industry and the location, but in general, I think some of the areas that we have that are special. One is we're next to the largest economic market in the world, and I think that's a huge advantage being here. Secondly, we're not part of that market, so we now have some differences around immigration, around education, around health. So I think those are important in terms of being able to distinguish ourselves as a North American place to do business. And I think our brand for Canada has clearly increased. We didn't get hurt in the financial crisis. Our banks are stable. We have relatively, I think, good government in terms of fiscal management that we're not necessarily seeing in other parts of the world. You add all those things up, and there's a lot of positives that you can talk to about people coming here. Though we don't drink all the Kool-Aid that sometimes gets dispensed, we are a small market. Jock's comments about innovation and productivity, I think there's more challenges on that score. And entrepreneurship, I think there's lots of opportunity, but with an economy that's been blessed with lots of resources, sometimes there's maybe the same edge in terms of having to compete.
Two things, because we sometimes are modest. The Canadian results in the international PISA test, which are for students in our high school and elementary school systems, were the second best in the Western world, beaten only by Finland. Our results were way, way better than the Scandinavian countries, the continental Europeans, and the United States. Secondly, we have a very high level, including in British Columbia, of people who are in post-secondary education. We need more graduate students, but we have a very high percentage of the population that is in or has been through post-secondary education and or community colleges. That rate compares very favorably with any other jurisdiction. So if you're an industry where the skills of your workforce and the education level of your potential customers is high, if that's what you need, then this province and indeed the country is well positioned.
Speaking of innovation, I've got a couple of questions here on SR&ED, and notably, I think, Jeff, in your remarks, you talked about the Jenkins report. And so I'll try and piece these together. One is, is it really healthy for the government to try and pick winners, which is, I think, one of the sentiments here. And the second point here is that Canada has almost the lowest private sector investment in our as a percentage of GDP. How does perhaps some of the changes suggested in the Jenkins report address that, if at all?
So the conundrum is that by international standards, OECD data, the suite, S-U-I-T-E, of research and development tax credits in Canada is, if not the richest, one of the richest in the basket of OECD countries. So when you look at why we have low business R&D, it can't be because the tax incentives offered by this tax credit and IRAP and others are uncompetitive, very competitive. So why policymakers in Ottawa over some time have gotten increasingly frustrated with this is that they keep adjusting things like the small business tax rate down, they keep improving or try to improve the tax credits. Each new government comes into office and they introduce a new program or they sweeten the tax rate. And they haven't gotten the take-up. So that's why they've asked these three groups under Tom Jenkins and Howard Alpert, the Science and Innovation Council, former Vice President of the University of Ottawa for Research, and before that, the committee under Wilson, about improving competitiveness. So now they've got these three reports, and they're all coming to this conclusion that the existing programs and tax incentives that we have just aren't doing the job. So then you get to the risk that whoever asked the question raised, which is that if you're going to put in the hands of an innovation council a certain number of dollars, what's to say that the dollars aren't going to be targeted for political reasons to this riding or that industry or this province? And what's to stop an industry from saying, well, in order to get the money, we need to hire some consultant to go lobby it in? I think they're going to try really hard to create an innovation council. It's a bit like the branding councils we have for universities that really are quite arm's length and removed from government, and that they're going to make decisions based on their best expertise as to where the dollars should best be spent. Now, are there risks in that? Absolutely. But they've kind of said, what we've been trying isn't working. And Howard Alpert, who I know very well, says, on the basis of having studied other countries' R&D programs, that the direct grant method actually produces better results. That's what he tells me. He's an expert. I'm just reporting to you what he said. And I think the government has bought that argument. Partly faute de dieu, and partly because they actually think intellectually is a better approach. And just from BC's point of view, as I said, because BC's access to the scientific and research tax credit was low, partly because so much of it went into two industries BC doesn't have much of, maybe this newer system might be your...
I think,
the
Board of Trade absolutely right. I think there's big changes coming to the federal and a lot of people who got used to the status quo will be unhappy. The lesson for BC is as the government of Canada adjusts its innovation policies, including the tax components, we need to make sure we're in alignment with where they want to go so we can leverage federal dollars to be effective. It makes no sense whatsoever to have a made in BC innovation agenda going in this direction. If the federal government's going in that direction, we need to take advantage of whatever we're going to do to benefit our province.
That's all the time we have for questions, gentlemen. Thank you very, very much for some insightful thoughts and comments there. We very much appreciate it. And with that, we have a few parting gifts. How appropriate. With that, I'll turn it back to Wendy. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you so very much for joining us today. We hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much again to AdvantageBC and to KPMG, and have a wonderful, financial, successful day. Thank you.